On the 5th of April 1933, the President of the United States signed an order making it a criminal offense for an American citizen to own gold. Not to trade it, not to export it, to own it. Every gold coin, every gold bar, every gold certificate in private hands was to be delivered to a Federal Reserve Bank by the 1st of May. Anyone who kept theirs faced a fine of up to $10,000 or up to 10 years in prison or both. $10,000 in 1933 was more than most Americans would earn in a decade. And people complied, not universally and not without complaint, but overwhelmingly. Across a country of 125 million people, with a deep suspicion of federal power and a constitutional tradition built around property rights, the gold came in. Then 9 months later, the government changed the price. Citizens had been paid $20.67 per ounce. In January 1934, the official price was reset to $35. The same metal, the same vaults, a different number. This video is about how that happened, what the gold standard actually was, and why it had become a trap, what the order did and did not cover, whether anyone was ever prosecuted, what the revaluation really transferred and to whom, and how the Supreme Court came to rule that the United States government could break its own written promises and pay nothing for it. And we will be careful about the parts that are genuinely argued over, because this episode attracts more confident assertion than the evidence supports, from people who regard it as necessary emergency policy, and from people who regard it as the largest confiscation in American history. Start with the situation, because the order makes no sense without it. By March 1933, the American banking system had effectively stopped. The Depression was 3.5 years old. Roughly, a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Prices had fallen by around a quarter since 1929, and that deflation, which sounds pleasant if you have money, was strangling everyone who owed any. That point deserves a moment, because it is the engine of the whole story. If you borrowed $1,000 in 1929 to buy a farm, you owe $1,000 in 1933. But the crop you sell to service that debt fetches far less than it did. Your income has collapsed. Your obligation has not moved. In real terms, your debt has grown enormously, without a single dollar being added to it. Multiply that across a nation of mortgaged farms, mortgaged homes, and indebted businesses, and you have a country where the arithmetic of survival gets worse every month regardless of how hard anybody works. Deflation was not a statistic. It was a machine for converting solvent people into bankrupt ones. And the banks were failing, not a few banks, thousands. When a bank failed, its depositors lost their savings outright, because there was no federal deposit insurance until later that year. So every failure taught the public a lesson, and the lesson was, get your money out first. That is a bank run, and by early 1933 it had become general. People were queuing to withdraw cash. And a significant number were not stopping at cash. They were converting dollars into gold, which they were perfectly entitled to do, because the dollar was legally redeemable in gold. By February, the runs had jumped from individual banks to whole states. Governors began declaring bank holidays to stop the bleeding. Michigan first, then others, in a cascade, until by the beginning of March, most of the country's banking system was either shut or operating under emergency restrictions. Roosevelt was inaugurated on the 4th of March. 2 days later, he declared a national bank holiday and closed every bank in the country. Understand what that means. Not restricted hours. Closed. Nobody could get their money anywhere for the better part of a week while emergency legislation was drafted. A modern economy with no functioning payment system, running on credit at the grocers, and whatever cash happened to be in people's pockets. That is the setting, not a stable country deciding to grab some gold. A country whose financial system had stopped working, run by an administration 2 days old. Now the mechanism, because this is the part that explains everything. The United States was on a gold standard. That is a phrase people use loosely, so let us be precise about what it actually constrained. The dollar was defined as a fixed quantity of gold, $20.67 to the troy ounce. Federal Reserve notes were redeemable for gold on demand. And by law, the Federal Reserve had to hold gold reserves equal to a minimum proportion of the currency it issued, around 40%. Follow that through and you find the trap. If the Federal Reserve wanted to expand the money supply, to make credit available, to fight the deflation that was crushing debtors, it needed gold reserves to back the additional currency. It could not simply create money. The gold ratio was a hard ceiling. Now add the run. Every citizen who converted dollars into gold coin and took it home removed gold from the banking system, which reduced the reserves, which lowered the ceiling on how much currency could exist, which forced contraction at precisely the moment the economy needed the opposite. That is the trap in one sentence. The more frightened people became, the more gold they withdrew, and the more gold they withdrew, the less the government could do about what frightened them. There was an international version of the same problem, and it was arguably worse. Foreign holders of dollars could also demand gold. Britain had already abandoned the gold standard in September 1931, a story we have told in full on our British channel. And after that, holders of every remaining gold currency began asking the obvious question about which country would go next. Gold flowed out of the United States in waves through 1931 and 1932. So the American authorities were being drained from both ends simultaneously, by their own citizens at home and by foreign claimants abroad. It is worth saying plainly that this was not a hidden mechanism or a matter of opinion. Everyone involved understood it. The argument was not about whether gold convertibility constrained monetary policy. It self-evidently did. The argument was about whether that constraint was a virtue or a catastrophe. Defenders of the gold standard held that the constraint was the entire point. A government that cannot print money cannot debase the currency, cannot fund itself by inflation, and cannot quietly transfer wealth from savers to borrowers. The discipline is the product. Remove it and you have handed politicians a lever they will eventually pull. The opposing view, which Roosevelt's advisors held, was that a rule preventing you from acting in an emergency is not discipline. It is a suicide pact. A monetary system that requires a quarter of the workforce to remain unemployed in order to preserve a number is a system that has confused the instrument with the objective. That disagreement has never been settled, and this video is not going to settle it. But it is the actual disagreement, and it is more interesting than the version where one side is simply stupid. And here is something most accounts of 1933 leave out entirely, which changes how the whole thing reads. America had already had this fight, once ferociously, a generation earlier, and the side that lost in 1896 won in 1933. Through the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, the great political question in American economic life was gold against silver. The country had been on an effective gold standard since the 1870s, and the consequence was exactly what you would expect: a slowly shrinking money supply relative to a rapidly growing economy, and therefore falling prices, year after year, decade after decade. For creditors, Eastern banks, bondholders, the financial establishment, this was excellent. Every dollar they were owed grew more valuable while they waited. For debtors, and above all for farmers in the West and the South, mortgaged to the hilt, selling crops into falling prices. It was ruinous. The same machine that would grind through the 1930s was already grinding through the 1880s, just more slowly. Their demand was the free coinage of silver. Add silver to the monetary base, expand the money supply, stop the deflation. And in 1896, that argument produced one of the most famous speeches in American political history, when William Jennings Bryan told the Democratic Convention that they should not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. He won the nomination on that speech. He lost the election. And in 1900, the Gold Standard Act settled the question formally, putting the dollar definitively on gold alone. So the constraint that broke in 1933 was not some ancient natural feature of American life. It was a specific policy choice, made deliberately in living memory, over the loud and organized objection of the people it hurt most. Which means that when Roosevelt took the country off gold, he was not inventing a heresy. He was completing an argument that had been running for 60 years, and doing it with the same coalition of debtors, farmers and Westerners that had lost it the first time. Bryan had died in 1925. His argument had not. Hold that thought, because it complicates the story of 1933 considerably. This was not purely an emergency improvisation. Part of it was a settled American political tradition finally getting its turn under cover of a crisis. So the legal instrument. On the 9th of March, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act. Passed it in a single day. The House is said to have voted on a bill that had not been fully printed, with members working from a single read-aloud copy. Among other things, it amended the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, a wartime statute, to give the president authority over gold transactions during a declared national emergency. That is the legal foundation of everything that follows. A First World War enemy trading law, amended in an afternoon, applied to American citizens in peacetime. On the 5th of April, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102. Its terms were specific. All persons were required to deliver, on or before the 1st of May 1933, all gold coin, gold bullion and gold certificates in their possession to a Federal Reserve Bank or member bank. In return, they received dollars at the statutory rate of $20.67 an ounce. Now the exemptions, because they are usually forgotten and they matter. You could keep up to $100 in gold coin, about 5 ounces at the time, a meaningful amount for an ordinary household. Gold used in industry, in the professions, and in the arts was exempt, so dentists, jewelers, watchmakers, and manufacturers carried on working. And rare and unusual coins of recognized special value to collectors were exempt. That last exemption is the reason a great deal of 19th century American gold coinage survives today. And it is why the order is better described as a compulsory purchase of monetary gold than as a blanket seizure of everything gold-colored. Wedding rings were never at risk, whatever you may have read. Neither were watches, spectacle frames, or the fillings in anybody's teeth. This matters because the exaggerated version of the story makes the real one easier to dismiss. What actually happened was serious enough without embellishment. The state compelled the sale of a specific class of asset on pain of imprisonment at a price it set itself. You do not need to add fictional detail to that. Now the question everyone asks, was anyone actually prosecuted? The honest answer is, almost nobody, and the near absence of prosecutions is itself one of the most interesting things about the whole episode. There was no house-to-house search. There was no register of who owned what. The federal government had no practical means of finding gold coin in a private home and made no serious attempt to look. What it had instead was banks, Gold in a safe deposit box was reachable because the box was inside an institution the government could instruct. Gold buried under a floorboard was not, and everybody knew it. The best-known case involved a New York attorney named Frederick Barber Campbell, who held a substantial quantity of gold at his bank and sued when the bank refused to release it to him. He was subsequently charged. The prosecution ran into difficulties, and he was not convicted on the original indictment. The legal footing turned out to be shakier than the government's confidence had suggested. That is broadly the extent of the enforcement story. A handful of cases, almost all of them involving gold that was visible to the authorities because it sat inside an institution rather than a house. So why did people comply? Several reasons, and they are worth separating, because the answer is not simply fear. The first is that the alternative was to hold an asset you could not legally use. Gold you cannot spend, sell, or deposit is not wealth. It is a metal in a box. Its only value is the hope that the law will change back. And in 1933, that was a long and deeply uncertain bet. The second is that most Americans did not hold gold coin at all. The picture of a nation of gold hoarders is largely false. Ordinary people held banknotes. Gold coins circulated, but the large concentrations were in banks and among the wealthy. For the great majority of the population, the order changed nothing they owned. The third is atmosphere. In March and April 1933, the country was in a state of genuine emergency. The new administration was extraordinarily popular, and hoarding gold had been publicly framed as unpatriotic, as something that was actively deepening the crisis for everybody else. Roosevelt made that argument directly in his first fireside chat, in language a nation of frightened depositors found persuasive. Some banks reportedly published the names of large withdrawers. The social pressure was real, and it pointed in one direction only. That mix no realistic use for the asset, few people holding it, and a national mood in which keeping it looked like sabotage, explains the compliance far better than the threat of 10 years in prison, which was almost never used against anyone. And there is an unanswerable question sitting underneath all of this, which nobody can resolve and which is worth admitting rather than papering over. How much gold was never handed in? The Treasury knew how much it received. It had a reasonable idea how much had been minted over the decades and how much had gone abroad. The gap between those figures is large, but it is not evidence of mass defiance because coins are lost, hoarded, melted, exported and buried for 100 ordinary reasons over a century, and no ledger records any of it. What can be said is that the government never audited private holdings, never seriously tried to, and had no mechanism by which it could have. Anybody who quietly kept a bag of double eagles in a cellar in 1933 was, in practical terms, safe, and would have been sitting on a substantial and entirely unrealizable gain 9 months later, and a far larger one 40 years after that. Nobody knows how many did. That is simply a hole in the record, and the confident numbers you will sometimes see quoted for it are estimates dressed up as findings. Which brings us to what happened next, and to the part that generates the most heat. Between the deadline in May and the revaluation, the following January, there is an interlude that most accounts skip entirely, and it is worth a moment, because it tells you how improvised all of this really was. Through the autumn of 1933, the administration ran a gold buying program. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation purchased gold at a price the government raised, day by day, deliberately, in order to push the dollar down and prices up. The price was set each morning. Henry Morgenthau, then heading the RFC and shortly to become Treasury Secretary, recorded the process in his diary, The President in Bed. His advisors gathered round, settling on the day's number over breakfast. On one occasion, by Morgenthau's account, Roosevelt proposed raising the price by 21 cents because it was 3 times 7, and 7 was a lucky number. Morgenthau wrote that if anybody knew how they really set the gold price, they would be terrified. That anecdote gets used in two opposite directions, and both are slightly unfair. It is not evidence that policy was decided by superstition. The direction of travel, devalue the dollar, raise prices, was deliberate, coherent, and well understood by everyone in the room. But it is a genuine and unflattering indication of how much was being improvised from a man who was present. It also tells you what the destination was. The gold buying program was not the plan. It was the improvised route to the plan. And the world outside had already been told, in the bluntest possible terms, that it would not get a vote. In the summer of 1933, 66 nations gathered in London for a World Monetary and Economic Conference. Its purpose was to agree an international currency stabilization, to restore some order to exchange rates after Britain's departure from gold and the general collapse of the old system. The delegates had been working for weeks, and agreement was close. In July, Roosevelt sent a message from a yacht off the New England coast, rejecting the whole basis of it. Stabilizing exchange rates, he said in effect, was an old fetish, and the United States would not subordinate its domestic recovery to it. He was not going to tie the dollar's hands abroad while he was busy untying them at home. It became known as the bombshell message, and it killed the conference outright. Delegates went home. The last serious attempt at coordinated international monetary management before the war was over in a day. Whatever you make of the decision, it settles a question about intent. The devaluation was not an accident of crisis management, and it was not a reluctant last resort. Roosevelt blew up an international agreement in order to keep the freedom to do it. On the 30th of January 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act. It transferred ownership of all monetary gold, including the Federal Reserve's own, to the Treasury. And it authorized the president to fix a new value for the dollar in gold. The next day, the price was fixed at $35 an ounce. Work through what that means. Citizens had handed in gold at $20.67. The government now valued the identical metal at $35. That is an increase of roughly 69% in the dollar price of gold. Or, viewed the other way round, a devaluation of the dollar against gold of around 40%. The Treasury's gold holdings, unchanged in weight, unchanged in every physical respect, sitting in the same vaults they had been sitting in the day before, were suddenly worth about $2 billion more in accounting terms. That paper profit went to the government, and a large part of it was placed into a stabilization fund used to manage the currency. So the sequence is compulsory purchase at one price, then an official revaluation to a much higher price, with the entire gain accruing to the buyer who had set both numbers. This is where the argument becomes fierce, and both sides have a real case. The case that this was a confiscation is straightforward. Private citizens were compelled by criminal statute to sell an asset at a price the buyer controlled, and the buyer then raised the price. Anyone who had kept their gold, had it been legal to do so, would have been 69% better off in dollar terms within 9 months. The difference went to the state. Whatever the justification, that is a transfer, it was not voluntary, and compensation for it was never seriously contemplated. The case that this framing is misleading is also real, and it rests on what the dollars were actually worth. The revaluation was not a windfall the government pocketed for its own enrichment. Its purpose was to permit monetary expansion. More currency could now be issued against the same weight of metal, and to raise prices, which was the explicit, openly stated policy goal. Deflation was the disease, the devaluation was the prescription. And on that measure it worked, or at the very least it coincided closely with recovery. Prices stopped falling. The money supply expanded. Output grew strongly from 1933 to 1937. A substantial body of economic research treats leaving the gold standard as one of the more effective things done anywhere in the Depression, and notes that across many countries the timing of recovery lines up remarkably closely with the timing of that single decision. Britain left in 1931 and recovered early. France clung on until 1936 and spent the mid-30s in slump. The pattern is one of the cleanest natural experiments the discipline has ever been handed. There is a further point that complicates the confiscation framing. The citizen who handed in gold received dollars, and in a country where prices had fallen by a quarter, those dollars bought a great deal. They then held them through a period of deliberately rising prices. Whether any given individual finished better or worse off depends entirely on what they did next, and the honest answer is that it varies. What can be said without argument is narrower, and it is this: people were compelled to sell at a price that was then changed to their disadvantage, and the same policy that made them worse off measured in gold was also the policy widely credited with ending the deflation that was ruining them measured in everything else. Both of those are true at once. Anyone telling you only one of them is selling something. There is one more chapter, and it is the constitutional one, and in the long run it may be the most consequential part of the entire story. A great many contracts of that era contained what were called gold clauses: bonds, mortgages, corporate debt, railroad securities, government issues. The clause specified that payment must be made in gold coin of a particular weight and fineness, precisely to protect the lender against exactly this: against a government devaluing the currency. These were not obscure legal curiosities. Estimates put the total value of contracts containing gold clauses at around $100 billion, at a time when the entire national income was in the region of 50 or 60 billion. This was not a corner of the credit market, it was most of it. And devaluing the dollar while those clauses stood would have been futile or worse. Every gold clause debt would simply have risen by the amount of the devaluation. Debtors would have gained nothing at all. Many would have been destroyed outright by an obligation that grew 69% overnight. The very people the policy was designed to relieve would have been buried by it. So on the 5th of June 1933, Congress passed a joint resolution declaring gold clauses to be against public policy and unenforceable. Payment in legal tender would discharge the debt, whatever the contract said. That is the government abrogating, by statute, the terms of private contracts already signed, already priced, already relied upon. And far more remarkably, the terms of its own bonds, promises the United States had made in writing to people who had lent it money on the strength of them. The cases reached the Supreme Court and were decided in February 1935. In the private contract case, Norman against the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the court upheld the abrogation by 5 votes to 4. The government's constitutional power over the currency, the majority reasoned, necessarily included the power to set aside private provisions that would frustrate the exercise of it. You cannot grant a sovereign authority over money and then permit private parties to contract their way around it. 5 to 4, 1 vote. Had a single justice moved the other way, the devaluation would have collided with $100 billion of enforceable gold clauses, and what would have happened next is genuinely difficult to imagine. The government's own bonds were harder, and the court split the difference in a way that has puzzled lawyers ever since. In Perry against the United States, it held that Congress could not simply repudiate its own obligations. The power to borrow does not include a power to promise and then decline to perform. On the principle, the bondholder won. And then the court found that he had suffered no recoverable loss. Since it was illegal for him to own gold, he could not have taken delivery of it. Since the currency was what it was, he could not demonstrate a measurable injury. He was awarded nothing. So the United States was told, in the same judgment, that it had no right to break its promise, and that it would face no consequence whatsoever for having broken it. The dissent was blistering. Justice McReynolds, speaking for the four, is reported to have departed from his written text, and what he said extemporaneously is remembered far better than anything in the opinions. That the Constitution as they had known it was gone, that shame and humiliation were upon them. That is not a neutral description of a technical ruling on monetary powers. It is a judge telling the country from the bench that the government had broken its word and been permitted to. So how long did all this last? Longer than almost anyone expects. The ban on private gold ownership was not a temporary emergency measure that quietly lapsed once the crisis passed. It remained in force through the rest of the Depression, through the Second World War, through the entire post-war Bretton Woods system, through the 1950s and the 1960s. And it left one very visible monument, which most Americans can name without knowing why it exists. All that surrendered gold had to go somewhere. Coins were melted and recast into bars. The nation's monetary gold, now legally the property of the Treasury rather than the Federal Reserve, was consolidated, and the existing vaults, scattered across mints and assay offices in coastal cities, were judged neither large enough nor safe enough to hold it. So in 1936, the Treasury built a purpose-made bullion depository on a military reservation in Kentucky, inland, defensible, surrounded by an army post. The gold began moving there in 1937, shipped under guard by rail. That is Fort Knox. It exists because of 1933. The most famous vault in the world was built to house metal that had been, within living memory of its construction, in private hands. It is a useful reminder of the scale of what had happened. This was not a tidying up exercise. It required a new building, a military garrison, and the largest movement of precious metal in American history. Americans could not legally own monetary gold until the 31st of December 1974. 41 years. An entire generation lived their whole working lives unable to own it, and most of them never gave it a thought, because a prohibition that outlasts everyone's memory of its introduction stops looking like a prohibition and starts looking like the way things are. And by the time it was lifted, the world it had been built for had disappeared completely. The Bretton Woods system, in which other currencies were fixed to the dollar, and the dollar alone was fixed to gold, collapsed in August 1971 when the United States ended dollar convertibility. That is a story we have told in full elsewhere on this channel. But note the timing here. Once the dollar had no gold anchor at all, there was no monetary reason whatsoever left to stop citizens holding the metal. The prohibition had outlived its own purpose by more than 3 years before anybody got round to removing it. That is worth remembering the next time an emergency measure is described as temporary. Let us end with what this case actually shows, because the lesson people usually draw from it is not the interesting one. The usual reading is a warning about government power. They took the gold once, and they could do it again. That is not wrong, but it is thin, and it misses the mechanism entirely. The mechanism is this: the gold standard was a rule designed to bind the government's hands. That was its entire purpose and its entire appeal. The whole argument for it was that a promise backed by metal cannot be quietly broken by a politician. And when the constraint became genuinely intolerable, the government did not respect it, and it did not quietly evade it. It abolished it by statute. In a fortnight, using a wartime law amended in an afternoon. That is the uncomfortable finding, and it holds regardless of your politics or your view of the gold standard itself. A rule that binds the government binds it only while the government finds the alternative preferable. When the cost of keeping the rule exceeds the cost of removing it, the rule goes, and a legislature under sufficient pressure can remove it very much faster than anyone planning around it expects. The gold clauses make the same point far more sharply, and this is why they matter more than the coins ever did. Those contracts were written by the most sophisticated parties in the entire economy: banks, railroads, insurers, professional lenders, who had specifically anticipated this exact risk and drafted precisely against it. They did everything right. They identified the danger, they wrote the protection, they priced it in, and they took it in good faith from a government that had signed the very same clause into its own bonds. It was voided by resolution, and the voiding was upheld 5-4. You cannot contract your way out of a currency decision. That is the real lesson of 1933 and 1935, and it is considerably more useful than the version about hoarding, because it applies to people who will never own a single ounce of anything. And there is a final asymmetry worth stating plainly, because it is the human core of the whole thing. The citizen who walked into a bank in April 1933 and handed over their gold coin at $20.67, an ounce was obeying the law. They were acting patriotically, in the middle of a genuine national emergency, doing precisely what the government of the day asked of them in a crisis they had played no part in creating. A great many of them were proud to. 9 months later, the price was $35. Nobody was compensated for the difference. Nobody was ever going to be, and nobody ever seriously proposed it. It was not fraud, and it was not concealed. The revaluation was announced, debated, legislated, and reported in public, in the newspapers in plain language, for anyone who cared to read it. It was simply what happens when one party to a transaction also gets to set the price. Sources and method. This account draws on the text of Executive Order 6102, the Emergency Banking Act of 1933, and its amendment of the Trading with the Enemy Act, the Joint Resolution of June 1933 on Gold Clauses, the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, the Supreme Court's decisions in Norman against Baltimore and Ohio and Perry against the United States together with the dissent in those cases, the published Morgenthau diaries, contemporaneous newspaper reporting, and the substantial body of economic research on the Depression and on the timing of national recoveries relative to the abandonment of gold. Where the interpretation is genuinely contested, above all whether the compulsory purchase and subsequent revaluation is properly described as a confiscation. This video sets out both cases rather than quietly choosing one and presenting it as settled. Where a widely repeated claim is simply false, such as the idea that jewelry, watches, or wedding rings were seized, it says so.